I'm talking of treating each other with fairness. I'm looking at the African wildlife now, because I think that is something we need to also look into. Because when you were
Yes.
explaining it before, you speak to the fact that Africans have been dealing with this animal for very many years, for thousands of years before the European ever stepped their foot in Africa. And this is evidence. It is
Yes.
evidence in our art, in our culture, in our life, in our food, in our collective existence. Go to any painting, even in the cave in Africa, you will see that there is a direct relationship between the animal and the human being. What about the
Yes.
representation? Go to Egypt, for example, go to Zimbabwe, go to the Nubia, go to, there is a culture called the Nok culture in central Nigeria, dating back to about 3,000 years. Go to the representation. This is not the first time that Africans are getting in contact with the animal, because we know that all of us are part of the collective existence. So the question really
Yes.
is, who is in charge? I'm talking of today, of the animals in Africa, talking of wildlife.
That's a very important question, because I think the ownership of wildlife tends to be depends on the region and the country that you are in, and the policies and the laws of that country, whether the laws of that country have been decolonized enough or not. In some countries, the majority of the wildlife is in private hands. It's in private hands, and it's in the form of safaris, hunting camps, the tourism industry, and it rakes in billions. They tell you it rakes in billions and billions of dollars, but whose billions are they? Yes, they contribute to the GDP, but who's raking in the billions? Who's benefiting from that wildlife? How do you tell me, in a country, an African country, where the natives have no access to wildlife whatsoever? Someone who came on a ship in 1652 has got all the wildlife, owns the rhinoceros, they own the buffaloes, they own the giraffes, they own the impalas. Where did they get those impalas? Did they bring the impalas on the ship to Africa? Did they ship them from Europe to Africa, those elephants? That's a question that we need to ask. I know it's an easy question. It's a very difficult question. It's an uncomfortable question, but we need to ask. When we're talking about our natural resources, which includes our land, it also includes our wildlife. There needs to be a decolonization when it comes to that sector of wildlife management. In some countries like Zimbabwe, you find that they've got the largest herd if I'm not mistaken, they have the largest herd of elephants in the world, which is above 80,000, and it's wholly owned by the government. So you see the policies of a country. In the case of Zimbabwe, wildlife, yes, independent players can own wildlife, but it is the government that predominantly owns the wildlife. But in some countries, you don't see the same thing. It's predominantly a white minority who owns the wildlife. The question now that comes is, where did they get the wildlife? And whenever a black person is seen on a wildlife range or wildlife reserve, is deemed to be a poacher. But this is the primary stockholder of that resource, which is a sad situation indeed that we're having. And now we've got organs. You were talking about institutions. We have institutions like CITES, the Convention on Biodiversity, the World Wildlife Fund, etc., etc. Whose principles do they employ in advocacy, in trying to influence the policy when it comes to wildlife management? Whose policies are they pushing forward? Imagine a country like Zimbabwe has got 80,000 elephants. They are above the stocking rate. They are above the capacity which they have to maintain and conserve them. And they say we need to make to use that same resource to earn the monies for us to be able to manage them properly. And it's a problem. Cities will come in and say, no, it will encourage the trade in ivory and cause poaching, blah blah blah. You name it. But the same country that is supposed to be managing all that wildlife with no resources because of sanctions, with crippling resources because of sanctions, has to bear the brunt. And who has to bear the biggest brunt and the biggest expense of that elephant roaming around? It is the poor native African who stays in a village where the animal roams around, who has to experience the animal, the crops being raided, their areas being destroyed by the same animal because of overstocking. So our wildlife needs to be reconsidered. As we consider the land issue, let's reconsider the wildlife issue. It's our wildlife, it's our resources. It has to be 50-50. Again, the majority Black native Africans must have a stake in the wildlife sector. It's their resource, which was forcibly taken away from them by the colonialists. So it must not be a matter of debate. It must be a matter of engagement. Because either way, it's going to happen. It might not happen in our generation, but it's going to happen. Definitely it's going to happen. That thing is going to happen. We can't stop it, but it's going to happen. So rather do it now and do it in the proper way. Engage in a form of engagement, not in a form of defiance, not in the form of resistance, not in the form of arrogance, because it will not work out. At the moment, when it comes to our wildlife, we are not fully in charge at the large scale as Africans. But I think it's a process that will finally make us in charge of our wildlife resources, because we have these so-called independent players. I'll give you an example of a certain project. I'll not give the name of the project. That project is in Zimbabwe, and I asked the people about. In fact, I asked the people if I could visit and go see the animals that were there, just to see the animals that were there. It's an NGO. They told me that if I'm to come there and see the animals there, I must pay, and I must make a booking and pay for me to go and see the animals there. And it made me think. And there are a lot of such projects that are around, even here in South Africa, even in Zimbabwe, and even in Botswana as well, and across Africa as well. If you want to go to those certain projects, you must pay. And you pay a European to go to a project that is in Africa, that is dealing with African animals. So a native African pays to go and see African animals to a European.